Hey, what's up YouTube? Today I'm going to talk about this little desert scene I created in Unreal Engine. I'm still using Unreal Engine 4 for hardware reasons, so no fancy nanite nor lumen. I use backlighting, quite low poly meshes, and it runs at almost 1200 FPS on 7 years old hardware, yet it still looks quite decent I think, so I thought I'd share some info about my process and also explain a couple of tricks I used here and there. This project was at first just a rock sculpting exercise to then release a stylized rock asset pack on my Patreon, but then it grew into something a bit bigger. As usual, I'd get carried away. Anyway, let's get started. Rocks, let's start with that. I'm not gonna lie, this is not an easy part and there's no magic solution to this. You'll probably want to use ZBrush or any decent sculpting software that has hard surface brushes, something equivalent to ZBrush's famous Trim Smooth Border brush, and spend hours, if not days, sculpting rocks. It's, in my opinion, incredibly hard and something I struggle a lot with still, despite having sculpted rocks for years. My workflow is kinda atrocious to be honest, a lot of back and forth, like trying shapes, styles, amount of details and so on, to get the desired look, so I'm not really going to bother you with that. Honestly, I found this tutorial by this incredible artist to be very nice, so I'd recommend giving it a look if you're interested. It's a paid tutorial, but it's really affordable and you'd support an artist, so that's always nice. Don't expect to find a magic solution in that tutorial though, like that famous sculpt brush that would do everything for you. It doesn't exist, but it's always great to see a master at its craft doing its thing. You always pick up a thing or two. Sculpting rocks is a long, tedious and sometimes painful process of learning to make a composition, if that makes sense. Because really a rock is just that. It's a picture on its own and it must follow the usual composition rules to be pleasing to look at. Ideally, a rock has a strong and interesting silhouette, interesting shapes and features, a nice balance between low and high frequency details, so your eye can rest in some areas and it's not just a complete busy mess. But it also has to be somewhat physically plausible, right? There are three grand groups of rocks, the most typical one being sedimentary rocks, which are basically formed by the deposition of minerals, and those can vary over time and create layers of different materials with different physical properties. And then there's a bunch of incredibly varied and complex natural phenomena that occurs on those different layers, from water infiltrating those sediment layers and possibly freezing, thus expanding and cracking the rock, to erosion, thermal expansion and contraction with hot days and cold nights, wind and so on. On top of that, you also have some artistic direction to apply, right? Possibly some form of stylization to add and so on. And then you have to think how your rock pieces are going to be kit-bashed together in engine to create bigger rock formation, cliffs and so on. So sculpting rock is a huge package that you have to keep in mind from start to finish. It's a bunch of artistic constraints because in the end you have to create a nice looking picture, right? And it's a bunch of natural processes that you have to understand and replicate to ideally sculpt and create the best looking rock. Here I by no means pretend to have mastered it, it's quite meh still, but I'm my worst critic, so who knows. I always struggle with creating interesting and natural looking shapes and also finding a good balance between low and high frequency details, and I tend to go into the detailing phase too soon and add too much details. But who knows, maybe one day I'll master that craft, if one can even ever pretend to do so. For now it's as good as I can do, and it's way better than I could do years ago, so I'm progressing, I guess, slowly, yay! Anyway, once I had sculpted my rocks in ZBrush, I created the low poly models. You could use nanite, I guess, and skip this, but I suppose I'm old-fashioned. Using decimated version of the high poly meshes is usually a decent starting point. If you're on a production and short on time, these can even be your final low poly meshes, but there's a few issues with this. First, decimation has a tendency to create bad triangles like so, which can be noticeable sometimes. Second, such topology is not great if you want to use vertex painting in engine to drive some effect, whatever it may be. Most decimation algorithms remove vertices from flat surfaces first, right? So you end up with a very uneven vertex density and then it's kinda hard to paint vertices. And third, that kind of topology once smoothed can sometimes lead to not ideal bakes. The normal map baked from the high poly has a lot of vertex normal variation to correct, and that tends to create strong gradients, and depending on the normal map compression settings and all that, it can be noticeable. Plus there's a lot more gradients in the texture to compress, so it might even lead to heavier normal map textures, but don't quote me on that. So I'd argue spending time to make that topology a bit more uniform in case you want to use vertex painting and have some control over the vertex normals can be worth it. Anyways, then I unwrap those meshes, trying to leverage cracks and crevices to hide seams as much as possible. You still have to add seams on edges here and there to reduce distortion, and that can lead to visible seams once you add detailed texturing if you do so, but that's how it goes. Packing UVs can be done using tools. UE has one to create light maps, so you could leverage that if desired, but I found that I always have much greater result doing it by hand. Again, if you're short on time, it may not be an option, but for instance, going from this automated packing to this manual packing allowed me to increase the textile density by around 10 to 15%, which can definitely result in sharper textures. Then I used Substance Painter to create the material. I kept it somewhat simple, just using some smart masks to randomize some colors here and there, and toy a bit with the roughness and specular as well. Ideally, as far as I know, you shouldn't really change the specular level. 0.5 is the default value and is the actual physical property of dielectric materials. But then we're toying a bit with some form of stylization anyway, and lowering the specular can help push the saturation a bit. Anyway, keep the material somewhat simple if you want to keep your asset stylized, let the normal map do its job. It's very easy to add too much noise, like I usually do. Once in engine, I created some LODs using the built-in tool. Always make sure to set the LOD distance yourself though. I also incremented the light map resolution of those bigger rocks, both here and for the light map UV generation. I kept the overall light map resolution kinda low for this scene. I felt like that gave me good enough results. Nowadays, I pretty much always turn on material attributes and build my materials one step at a time using get and set material attributes nodes. It's in my opinion much more readable that way. So here first I set up my base maps, color, normal, roughness, ambient occlusion and specular. Here's also one benefit of using material attributes: you can pass the material attributes to a material function and iterate on the whole material in that function. This particular function just multiplies base color with a color gradient built using the z-world coordinates, nothing too fancy. So I can just further darken the base of my rocks and or lighten the top. Here I create a sort of sediment layer effect. I get the world position, mask its Z component to build a vertical gradient, and further offset that gradient somewhat randomly with a noise texture. That gradient is then used as a coordinate to sample a one-dimensional texture, and that gets multiplied by the base color. It's also desaturated here to have a black and white value and drive some variation in the roughness and specular as well, and that can be used to create that kind of horizontal pattern. Sweet. Here this material function simply samples the tiling normal map to add a bit of details up close. It's faded out by distance because LOD1 uses a cheaper material that doesn't make use of that material function. So we want to smoothly transition between LOD0 and 1 and have that material effect disabled by the time LOD1 kicks in. Now, horizontal details. This, I went back and forth a million times, trying multiple techniques. At first, I used the good old triplanar mapping technique, but then triplanar mapped normal maps are a pain in the butt to do properly. In case you're not aware of that, I'll post a few links in the video description below explaining the reason for this. It has to do with mesh tangents and all. It's not the end of the world, you have to swizzle channels around. But then this big rock in particular was quite troublesome, because with triplanar mapping you have to build masks to select which texture sample to use, right? Usually using vertex or pixel normals. And this rock is the worst case scenario for this. You see it has some big planar faces that are somewhat facing a bit in between two axes, and so creating directional masks was a bit annoying to do right, and in the end I actually don't even need triplanar mapping here, because the detailed textures I'm trying to add are kinda well directional, if I may say, right? They're really meant to only show on side faces, so I technically would only need biplanar mapping. I also toyed with a single sample triplanar mapping method, but had issues masking the few artifacts that comes with that technique, especially with stylized art where it's a bit more noticeable, but still I highly recommend you to take a look at it. I'll post a link in the video description below. Anyway, there's a million solutions to this, all with pros and cons as usual. In the end I used the most basic approach, which turns out was the most performant one and was good enough. I used a second UV map with a box UV projection, as simple as that. However, that creates two issues. First, it creates quite visible seams, but then I used vertex painting to fade out that detailed texturing in areas where seams were the most visible. Plus, you don't really notice them anyway, unless you really pay attention. Second issue, it kinda constrains the user to have those rock meshes oriented a particular way. So if you want to kit bash rocks together in engine and orient them in all kind of way, it kinda breaks down. For this reason, I made duplicates of some of these rocks to have them oriented in a bunch of way and have that box UV mapping done accordingly. Now sound, this is quite simple. I just use the pixel normal Z component to create a mask and lerp a color and a roughness value to procedurally add some sound. It can even be faded out based on world Z, so that this deposit of sound might be strong near the ground and quite weak at a certain height. The sky is the limit really when it comes to this kind of shader tricks. It's all about what you need and what you're willing to pay for that effect. Moving on, desert pixel depth offset. That can help blend assets together, but it's actually turned off here because I ended up using contact shadows, and just like with dynamic shadows, pixel depth offset can cause self-shadowing issues. Normally I don't use pixel depth offset anyway because I use dynamic lighting most of the time, and with dynamic lighting you can use virtual textures to have pixel perfect transition between assets. With static lighting, however, blending assets is definitely more of an issue. See here, this sand pile doesn't blend too nicely with the ground, despite having the same exact PBR properties and normals, and in that case pixel depth offset can help to smooth things out, but again contact shadows causes very strong self-shadowing artifacts, so I restrain myself from using any pixel depth offset trick. Last function is a blend function that makes use of virtual textures to sample the landscape color and PBR properties, but I ended up not using it on most assets because once again static lighting doesn't allow that kind of trick to work very well. And that's how I built my rocks in a nutshell. One last thing that can usually be of great help is to use decals. So I sculpted those cracks in ZBrush and made some decals that I could place here and there to add some extra details. Now, it's always great to give your scene a sense of scale. It's one thing to make a huge rock, but that rock alone doesn't give you much. Whereas if you add debris, pebbles, smaller rocks and other elements like trees and grass, you give the viewer some sort of reference point, right? And it helps to tie everything together. So yeah, I sculpted some pebbles, rocks and some tiling textures that I could paint on the landscape as well to create even more smaller pebbles where needed. One thing to try is to build things in a way that makes sense, like this rock is falling apart, right? It's being eroded, so there should be a buildup of materials and debris and pebbles around it, right? Ideally, you'd want your environment to tell a story, like you'd be able to tell what happened here and why things are the way they are currently. I also created that sand build-up mesh to further enhance the transition with the ground. So I made some noise displacement pattern in Blender that I ran through World Machine to process an erosion path and get that kind of shape. It's not great, but it does the job. It helps to bring a bit of details where needed. Grass. Now, I'm only going to briefly mention this topic because this video is already long enough and I'm working on a video dedicated to style as grass anyway. However, this desert scene was a nice opportunity for me to try something new, because I knew I wouldn't spam my whole landscape with grass instances. Those would be placed by hand here and there. It's a desert after all, not a freaking jungle, right? So, because it was going to be quite scarce, if you may say, I actually was okay with having grass that's slightly more expensive. You see, nowadays I'm kinda obsessed with the idea of grounding objects, especially with stylized art, where everything is kinda kept somewhat simple and scarce. Everything's clean, there's not many assets or noise, so you much more easily notice assets clipping through geometry and things like that. Like it's feeling a bit out of place sometimes, and I want things to feel like they're part of the world, right? And grass is no exception. So here I modeled a few grass clumps, and for each of these I actually sculpted some kind of ground, and using a low poly mesh and a translucent material, I could turn those ground meshes into some sort of handmade decals to add extra normal details and ambient occlusion to the ground. It's quite subtle, but see, this is without and this is with. The grass feels like it's much more connected to the ground, right? Here contact shadows are quite noisy, but I kinda like the look it gave to the scene, so I kept them on. The translucent material used to achieve this effect is quite cheap. It samples the scene color and modulates it based both on an ambient occlusion map and a dot product between the sunlight vector and a world normal to fake some directional light. It's further masked by comparing that world normal with the underlying surface world normal. It's a bit of a cheat, really. Truthfully, at first I used the decal material to turn those meshes into actual decal meshes, and it worked fine, and decal meshes were, to my surprise, instanced, so performance was still great. It looked great and was responding properly to lighting. However, when migrating this project to UE5 later on, I realized that those decal meshes were no longer working. They just had disappeared. Not exactly sure why, honestly. Seems like decal meshes with instant static mesh components or foliage components are kinda broken, I'm not sure. So I had to find a sketchy workaround using a translucent material. It's still fine, but it will produce fake lighting in shadowed areas, so that's not that great. Also, one issue is that this mesh really needs to be pretty much flushed against the landscape for this effect to properly work, and even though each grass instance is somewhat accurately placed on the landscape surface when you paint them using the foliage tool, that may not be enough. To fix this, I first vertically project both the grass blades and that translucent mesh onto the ground using a virtual texture to sample that landscape height, right? The thing is that landscape is quite big, and depending on your virtual texture settings, well, that virtual texture might be too low res and be somewhat approximate, and so that projection trick on its own might still not be enough. To actually properly fix this, I used a trick that I feel like should be illegal, but it seems to work fine. So basically I project that landscape onto itself. Yeah, I know, I also felt like I was about to create some sort of black hole doing that, but it's working just fine and we are still all alive, so I suppose it's fine. You see, this landscape writes its world Z into its virtual texture before any offset is applied. And then that same virtual texture is sampled here to offset the landscape in Z and match the world height actually stored in that virtual texture. And voila, both the landscape and meshes projected onto it use the same world Z to drive their vertical offset, and it perfectly matches. The three base meshes were built in Blender using curves that I then exported to ZBrush for sculpting. The low poly models were lazily created using decimated version of the sculpts, because that was good enough, and materials were authored in Substance Painter the same way I did for the rocks. Smaller branches were created by actually rendering those low poly tree models like so, and then I created cards that I placed here and there on each tree. I then further tweaked the sculpts a tiny bit more just to at least try and make those cards feel somewhat connected to the trees. Now, wind animation, I'm not too stoked with the end result, but I suppose it's good enough. I used Vertex Paint to encode some data to drive the wind animation. The red channel was used to enable fast wind motion on the tip of those branch cards, the green channel was used to enable some secondary motion on the bigger branches, and the blue channel to encode a somewhat random value per branch group to offset the wind animation so that this branch motion isn't in sync with that one. In Engine, I created a color curve that has some wave pattern. It's sampled in the tree material to push vertices in the wind direction with a varying intensity. It's done once for the smaller branches, once for the bigger branches, and once more for the overall tree to create several layers of motion stacked on top of each other. The final XY displacement is then passed to this material function, which does a spherical reprojection, so vertices cannot be displaced further away from the tree's pivot point than their original distance to it. That leads to some deformation in the mesh, but it sort of mimics a rotation despite being drastically cheaper and easier to set up than a true rotation. But I will explain this technique in more details in an upcoming video, so stay tuned and get subscribed if you don't want to miss it. Anyway, that wind animation offset is faded out based on distance, so the more distant we are to a tree, the more still it is. That's done because at a distance we transition to an LOD that uses a cheaper material, one that has no wind displacement at all, so the wind is gradually turned off at LOD 0 so that there's no visual difference when LOD 1 kicks in. Moving on, a tree is made up of 4 components. There's the trunk, some branch cards, but also some kind of sand pile and a translucent mesh used to draw a subtle VFX. That sand pile mesh helps to make a tree feel like it's properly grounded, right? It's not just an asset that has been drag and dropped and that simply clips through the landscape. because ideally everything should feel like it's a part of a whole, and that tree should have some sort of impact on the environment, right? So that sand pile helps a bit with that. It brings some details, adds a more intricate intersecting line, and also darkens the sun color around the tree, kinda like some fake ambient occlusion. I went even further, and given a wind direction, I flattened that sand pile mesh in the opposite direction. It's quite subtle, but it further helps tie everything together. This tree has an impact on the environment, but the environment itself should also have some sort of impact on it, right? It's a bit of a feedback loop. Anyway, that effect is done by sampling the landscape world height virtual texture to vertically project that sand pile mesh on it. At this point it's completely flattened, so its original height is added back, but only where I want to, right? So based on a directional mask that I compute using a simple dot product. Alright, so this sand pile isn't necessarily costly, but still it's a draw call, there's some triangles to compute, a shader and all that. So it all starts to add up in the end, and so I actually want to discard that mesh in the distance. And so I set a max draw distance on that mesh component, and to just not have it simply disappear once that camera distance is reached, that mesh is pushed downward in the shader the further we are from it. So by the time it should be disabled because distant enough, it should have smoothly disappeared under the ground first. The second mesh is used to create some wind blowing effect that goes around the tree trunk. It's similar to the landscape VFX that I created using cards, more on that in a second. Essentially it's a translucent material that draws a scrolling texture, right? It's faded out by distance, so that it slowly disappears by the time that same max draw distance set on that component is reached. It's also always facing the wind direction, so that VFX mesh could even be part of the tree mesh, and that tree mesh freely rotated in yaw, and that VFX mesh would still stay oriented towards the wind. That's done using this material function. I get the wind direction and derive a single axis rotation matrix from it to reorient the mesh, and voila. Oh, and I also created a skull that tiles to add a bit of detailed texturing in engine. And that's it for the trees. Moving on, I created a subtle sound blowing effect using two different layers. First, once I had built that scene in Unreal Engine, I exported the landscape on all assets to FBX. In Blender I could then create cards that I could subdivide and kinda sculpt to make them go around objects and give some sense of flow. I also projected those cards vertically onto the landscape to have them pretty much flushed against it, right? I then created a cheap noise tiling pattern in GIMP that I scrolled on those cards using a cheap unlit translucent material that really just samples the scene color and boosts it by some amount depending on that scrolling texture. A second but similar effect is also added globally this time. At first it was built in the landscape material, but I wasn't too happy with that effect being somewhat abruptly cut off around pebbles, sand piles and any other intersecting mesh. I could have added that same effect on those other meshes as well, or found some workaround, but I chose to go another way and I ended up with quite a bizarre approach. I already explained it a few days ago on my Twitter, and I should have posted a link to the Twitter thread in the video description below, but I'm going to briefly mention it in this video still. Basically, I first built that sort of quad tree mesh in Blender. In Engine, that mesh was then made to rotate along with the camera in yaw using a cheap 3x3 transform matrix and world position offset. It then snapped right below the camera's position, so the mesh moves around with the camera. Now, the landscape writes its world height into a runtime virtual texture, right? So I can then sample that world height to deform the mesh in Z and have it flushed against the landscape, and any other mesh that might write its world height into that virtual texture as well. I also sample that same virtual texture right underneath the camera's position to compute how vertically distant the camera is to the ground and use that value to scale that mesh, so that when we zoom out the mesh is scaled accordingly and it sort of maintains a constant draw distance. And then it's offset in Z, and using a depth fade node I can display a translucent effect on top of the whole landscape and have that effect smoothly fade out near obstacles and any intersecting geometry. I could even add hidden geometries that write their world height into the virtual texture and sculpt that mesh in Z. Quite interesting. It's arguably a bit sketchy and you'd have to work a bit more on the effect to support custom camera FOV and possibly constrain that effect to a specific area and things like that, but it could be a useful trick to have in your bag. It certainly adds some overdraw, but then one nice thing about that approach is that you can control the distance at which this effect is computed in camera space by scaling in and out that mesh, right? So certainly such effect would be cheaper to compute if added directly onto the landscape material, but you would end up paying the pixel cost of that effect all the way up to the horizon, where it's really not noticeable. Here that translucent effect is kinda limited in distance, right? So I would argue it could even be cheaper in the end, despite the extra overdraw. It seems like my good old 970 GTX graphics card doesn't seem to care at all if that effect is displayed or not, so it seems like it's relatively cheap overall. Anyway, a tiling noise texture is crawled on that mesh using world position coordinates to create the global sound blowing effect. But I deform those world position coordinates using a sort of flow map I rendered in Blender. To do that, I pretty much just bake the tangent space normals of that entire scene, and the X and Y component of that normal map are used to distort the coordinates at which that scrolling texture is sampled to have that kind of flow around objects effect. Neat. So it's always a great idea to add a bit of life to your scenes, right? Here I use the Niagara particle system to create circling vultures. Now this video is already long enough, so I'll make a follow-up video very soon to properly explain how it was built, but it's kinda cool. Birds are circling, diving, gaining some speed and gliding for a while before climbing up again. That effect is built using an extremely low poly mesh, a cheap material and vertex animation, so it's super efficient. So stay tuned for the follow-up breakdown video. Last couple of things I can think of, I added some distant meshes just to have something to render in the background. There's a few trees, but instead of using my actual tree models, I rendered cheap billboard cards and created a blueprint that spawns a couple of those billboards around a center point. Those trees are only a couple of pixels high when seen from the player's perspective, so there's really no need to go overboard. Same for those distant rocks, I exported these groups of rocks into FBX, built a couple of super low poly meshes in Blender using voxelization and decimation, and projected the textures, and voila, it's good enough for the Vista. Mountains were quickly created in World Machine and decimated in Blender to create a very low poly mesh. I also built a cheap heat haze effect using a cylindrical mesh and a translucent material to refract what's in the distance. That shader makes use of a panning normal map and even some desert noise to randomize the refraction direction and have the overall result being smoothed by temporal anti-aliasing, which results in some kind of blur. Super cheap trick, but it does the job. Alright, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video and that you learned something along the way. If you're interested in getting your hands on those rocks and trees, they are available separately as a tier 2 reward on my Patreon, and this entire scene is available as a tier 3 reward, so feel free to join in and gain access to tons of other cool educative projects like this and support me and my work. Thanks to all my Patreon supporters, and again sorry for the lack of updates this month. You know me, I tend to fall into rabbit holes quite often, and this project was just one more, I guess. I'll try to make up for it. Have a great day, take care of yourself, bye bye!